In many parts of the United States today, earning $100,000 a year is still widely considered a milestone, a symbolic threshold that once represented stability, comfort, and a sense of financial arrival. Yet for a growing number of people, crossing that line does not feel like progress. It feels like maintaining balance on a system that keeps shifting beneath them, where income rises but the structure around that income absorbs it almost immediately, leaving behind a quiet but persistent question about what actually changed. The experience often begins with expectation, because at some point earlier in life, that number was associated with a very different reality, one shaped by older economic conditions where housing consumed a smaller portion of income, where education did not require decades of repayment, and where basic services were less fragmented into recurring costs. So the assumption builds slowly that reaching this level will unlock a different lifestyle. But when it finally happens, the outcome does not match the internal model, and that gap between expectation and reality becomes the first signal that something structural has shifted. What makes this particularly subtle is that the pressure is not always dramatic or visible. It does not necessarily appear as financial crisis or instability. Instead, it shows up as a constant sense of tightness, where decisions feel constrained despite a relatively high income, where saving requires deliberate effort rather than happening naturally, and where unexpected expenses still disrupt planning in a way that feels disproportionate to the income level, creating a psychological contradiction between what the number suggests and what daily life actually delivers. A large part of this disconnect comes from how fixed costs have evolved, especially in areas like housing, healthcare, and education, where prices have increased not only in absolute terms but as a percentage of income, meaning that a larger share of earnings is committed before any discretionary decisions are even made. And because these costs are often non-negotiable, they reshape the entire financial landscape around them, reducing flexibility while maintaining the appearance of adequacy on paper. At the same time, there is a quieter layer of financial leakage that builds over time through modern consumption patterns, particularly in the form of recurring expenses, subscriptions, services, and convenience-based spending, which individually seem insignificant but collectively create a steady outflow that adapts almost perfectly to income increases. So instead of feeling excess capacity as earnings rise, many people experience a redistribution of that increase into smaller, less noticeable channels that gradually become permanent. This is where the psychological dimension becomes more important than the numerical one, because the human mind tends to recalibrate quickly to new baselines, a process often described in behavioral economics as adaptation, where what once felt like abundance becomes normal, and what was once optional becomes expected. So the lifestyle that forms around a $100,000 income does not feel luxurious or even particularly comfortable. It simply feels standard, and maintaining that standard requires continuous effort. If we look at the underlying math, the issue becomes clearer, because income alone does not determine financial freedom. What matters more is the relationship between income, fixed obligations, and the rate at which surplus can accumulate. And when fixed costs rise faster than income over time, even relatively high earnings can result in a low surplus ratio, meaning that only a small portion of income is available for saving, investing, or absorbing shocks, which limits the system's ability to create long-term stability. For example, when a significant percentage of income is allocated to housing, another portion to taxes, another to healthcare and insurance, and additional layers to transportation, debt servicing, and recurring expenses, the remaining margin can become surprisingly narrow. And because each of these categories tends to scale with lifestyle and location, increasing income does not necessarily widen that margin in a meaningful way. It often maintains it. This leads to a broader systemic observation about how modern economic environments distribute financial pressure, where instead of concentrating strain at lower income levels alone, the system stretches that pressure upward, creating a wider band of individuals who feel financially constrained despite earning what would historically be considered strong incomes. And this is not necessarily a failure of individual behavior, but rather a reflection of how cost structures and expectations have evolved together. Another important factor is the role of comparison and social context. Because financial satisfaction is not determined in isolation, it is influenced by the environment people operate in. And in many urban and high-cost areas in the United States, a $100,000 income may place someone within a certain statistical bracket, but their lived experience is shaped by the cost norms and spending patterns of their immediate surroundings, which can make that income feel average or even insufficient relative to what is considered normal in that context. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where income increases lead to lifestyle adjustments. Those adjustments increase baseline costs, and those higher costs require maintaining or increasing income just to stay in place, which can give the impression of forward movement while functionally preserving the same level of financial pressure. And this loop is often reinforced by long-term commitments like mortgages, leases, and financing agreements that lock in these higher cost structures. What makes this dynamic particularly important is that it shifts the definition of financial progress away from income milestones and toward structural efficiency, meaning that the key question is no longer how much is earned, but how much of that earning remains available after the system around it takes its share, and how resilient that remaining portion is over time. From this perspective, the feeling that $100,000 is not enough is less about the number itself and more about the environment in which that number operates, an environment where costs are layered, expectations are adaptive, and surplus is compressed. So the sensation of being financially stretched is not necessarily a contradiction. It is a reflection of how the system processes income at that level. Understanding this does not require dramatic conclusions or extreme interpretations. It simply requires recognizing that financial experience is shaped by ratios and structures rather than absolute figures, and that as those structures evolve, the meaning of income changes with them, sometimes quietly enough that it is only noticed when expectations no longer align with reality. In that sense, the question is not whether $100,000 should feel like enough, but why the conditions that once made it feel sufficient have shifted, and what that reveals about the broader mechanics of money, cost, and adaptation in the modern economy, where numbers alone no longer carry the same meaning they once did, and where financial clarity comes less from hitting a target and more from understanding the system that defines it.